We're leaving for Sugarloaf Mountain history tour.
So it's really been fortunate that we can be here. Yes,
Dave, I have a question. I've never been a really bushwhack through here, and I would like to kayak one day. Do you know where the actual crossing is? I've always wondered where the actual crossing is in this area that they would have used.
the Fabian, you mean the crossing that the Fabian Bridge was called the old Indian crossing, and a lot of people, I believe that would be the Fabian Bridge, was just up the river. The river kind of goes up, makes a big right curve, and it was just around the bend. But if you leave and turn left here and walk on this road and follow it around and go through the old road around the bottom, you're just below these hills, but you're above the on pretty good sand, but you're above the clay of the river bottom, the wet areas. The area does not flood. You follow it all the way around. You never cross a creek. You know, they've all worn out and came and gone below the ground. You really don't cross a real creek all the way around until you rise up and go down to Old Nashville. What was in Old Nashville on high ground, brought down into Long Mountain, and then went all the way around. That tree line you see that kind of pokes out down there, that would have been really the road. And then came on around and came out this road that we passed coming up from the bridge.
I've been wanting to kayak it so I could go in.
What do you think, Lynn?
That's fantastic.
So,
Yeah, we need this
our
property.
classroom is on the other side, but we'll talk a little bit about, is this the end of the crowd here?
Where is north and south, east and west?
Okay, north is right through there. Okay.
Where the woods
Now, can you see that power plant through there? It's about 30 miles from here. That's the power plant at Highway 14 and Highway 6 at Hammond.
Okay.
So you can see the smokestacks coming up over there. So that's a 30 mile. I always tell people I have a 30-mile view. Well, that's a 30 miles.
Wow.
I've seen my wife, so she's pulling up the rear. So. Well, it wasn't supposed to rain. Meaning it's raining. Yeah. There's this cutout right here. Okay. In 1994 to 96, there was some treasure hunters decided, through studying old records in Mexico and all, they decided that there was gold buried in Sugarloaf Mountain. And so they went about searching. They had a pretty high-tech approach, and they were going to find this gold that was in Sugarloaf Mountain. And there was some dynamics going on with the family that owned this property at that time, that they were splitting up their property amongst a son and a mother. But I know what a D7 will do. And so he literally comes up here, and they hack their way up the side of the hill and start gnawing away at the mountain. That's why Sugarloaf, look, this is original. But this would have continued, it's a cone shape. Sugarloaf is a cone shaped uplift. If you look at it from FM 485 over there, you'll see it still looks like a cone. But this little notch that's cut out was done by a D7. It's not natural, okay? And so they started cutting this out, and they had drilled. They had a drill over there just up the hill that they were trying to drill for gold. They didn't find that. He's cutting this out, and Ben, I mean, all hell broke loose, and people are mad, and it was just Sugarloaf Mountain. No one cared. You could come up here and picnic. I mean, you could come up here in the 1930s, and the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. I came here as a very, very small kid and kind of fell in love with mountains. And so you could, you know, it was just here. No one cared. This was part of a 5,000-acre ranch that as you go to Hanover and you head toward Cameron, you're looking at that big bottom land. This was all part of that 5,000 acres. And so Sugarloaf was the West 40. No one cared. I mean, they didn't care if you came up here and walked around, and there wasn't a liability worry. And everyone just always enjoyed Sugarloaf. And they still do, just now it's not very legal. And so that went on until all this happened with the gold hunting of the gold. And then really there were so many people that came out of the woodwork and said, man, I love that place. That's where I first kissed my wife a long time ago. And so it really had an effect. It stopped finally. They moved on, and this is what you see, this swell right here, this result. But otherwise, the point we're going to go to, the classroom, is really about the same as it's always been. I mean, obviously, this is sandstone. There's been erosion. Things have gone on here. One other little side history note is that I recently discovered is that, we know about La Tortuga, we know about Sugarloaf Mountain, but at one point it was called McClendon's Bluff, okay? And in about 1838, John McClendon was the brother of Neil McClendon, which McClendon County, Waco, is named after. And John came over from Nashville. He had a 15-year-old named John Cullens with him. And they were looking for, hunting for cattle, lost cattle around Sugarloaf. And they were attacked by Indians. And it was foggy, and the 15-year-old got away. And John was shot like a dozen times and killed. And so for a period of time there, the locals in 1838, and after that they called it McClendon's Bluff because of him dying here. Also, there was a lady that they interviewed in Georgetown 68 years after that, and she told the story as a little girl that they brought him in laid over a horse, and he had like a dozen arrows hanging out his back.
But I'm one of those Texans that once upon a time, my idea was I'm from Texas, and the farther away I am, the better off I am, because I left behind the seedy part of Texas that most of you know it has some seedy parts. In any case, so does the whole world. But I still raise cows up this little river and across at San Gabriel on the headwaters of Brushy Creek in country that looks just like this. And on our place there, I heard some of you talking, we have 44 acres, run a dozen cows, and you walk on the ridge, and it's a ridge of this same kind of sandstone, but it has a little sand on it. It's not good for anything but peanuts and watermelon, and which is what they used to grow here. Those of you that don't know, that's all the sandy country grew. But that place is covered from one end to the other in evidence of human beings who lived here before us and called it home just as much as Mr. Cunningham does, and just as much as my family does. And so here, the idea that the base of this hill has evidence of Indian people all around it. College Station, I tell my students every day, every building we sit in and talk at A&M, you're sitting on somebody's campsite. So how do you deal with something like that? That time frame, here's what I tell students. Remind me again, how many of you grew up within 100 miles of here?
100, I guess.
How many of you grew up within 500 miles? All right, that's most everybody. Yeah. But if you were here 15,000 years ago, I would say you could look right here and you would see a smokestack of some family living here. And if you looked around somewhere else, you would see a herd of elephants.
Wow.
Mammoth, mastodons. And they had been here for that time for way over 100,000 years. you could go from here all the way to Houston and follow mammoths all the way and mastodons. In the Brazos River, A&M, when I first came here, was excavating a mammoth that was processed and bones were piled up in the Brazos River 15 miles upstream from Highway 21. So the idea, Highway 21, just another thing, what do you guys call Highway 21? The Camino Real. So the first time I know of a written record of people that traveled the Camino Real all the way from Mexico City to East Texas was 1676. Now think about how much earlier is that than what we normally think of the Camino Real. Who judged that? Who said that? Those were Indian people from the Rio Bravo, the Brazos River, who had come to San Antonio, and from San Antonio they went all the way to Nacogdoches, and they talked to Caddo Indians, and they formed treaties with the Caddo Indians, who at that time were fighting Apaches, who were coming from the north. And they already knew from 100 years who was in Mexico City, and the Spanish were expanding. And so they wanted to get, in some way, they wanted to form alliances. And I'm going to wrap this right around to the highway that's really all around the Camino Real. So they wanted to form alliances because the Apaches were coming in. And the Apaches were coming in, I'm sure the Coal-Takans looked at the Apaches coming in the way our current administration looks at all the people in the caravans coming across the border to the north. So they were concerned about who was coming into their homeland. So they went up to East Texas. They had known East Texas for a long time. They went and talked with the Archbishop of Guadalajara in Mexico and said, you know, if you want to find a place to put big fortifications and Christianize a lot of Indians, go with those Caddo. They have kings and queens there. They bury people in temple mounds. That's the lure that brought the Spanish here, up this trail in 1676. Now that was 100 years before most of North America started to be gathered together in the way it is today. So if you push that back and you think, well, how did those people from the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande Valley, how did they know about East Texas? And then you could just say, well, here's how long ago they knew about East Texas. The very first guaranteed corn, beans, and squash that came from its origin place in central Mexico, southern Mexico, to the valley of the Mississippi and St. Louis and the biggest pyramids. You guys know there are pyramids outside of St. Louis, Missouri, that are as big as the base of the pyramids at Giza. Literally the same size. And they took, you know, kings and queens are buried in them. It was a stockaded village, town. It had 30,000 people in it. And if you didn't know that, ask yourself, why didn't you know this? You're all sentient beings. How long have you been around? How come you didn't know kings and queens and towns of 30,000 people that controlled areas far bigger than anything we can see here existed at St. Louis? The Coal-Takans and the people on the Rio Bravo knew that. The people in Mexico City knew that. And so the first time in Mexico City, traders coming up what we call the Camino Real, literally someone or some bodies brought seeds of beans and squash and corn. And they introduced those all the way, and they took best by the time they got to the Mississippi because it rains aplenty. So this was, archaeologists call this the Gilmore Corridor, because scientists sat together a long time ago and tried to figure out how did Indians in Mexico have corn, beans, and squash and great pyramids and great towns, and Indians in the Mississippi Valley had that, and there's nothing in between. That's because all the people knew that farming was a poor thing to do in Texas, and they all left. Farming is still very difficult here. And so it has a whole bunch of chert in it. And that chert, that's what Cabeza de Vaca. He's absolutely right. On the coast, there's no rocks. People on the coast traded from people inland to get stone and to make tools. And the biggest stone was in central Texas, and they traded all the way over and clearly took raw material from the middle of the hill country to East Texas on a regular basis. Traders did that all the time. somebody would have said what the weather's like in Nacogdoches, and they'd tell you 2 or 3 days later. They were cosmopolitans. There's a book called Native Peoples of Texas, and it talks about cosmopolitan Texas. We probably stayed long.
That we're in the Francisco Ruiz abstract. We're in part of the Francisco Ruiz League here in Milam County. Around 1832 to 36, he was awarded 32 to 34. He was awarded about 11 leagues in all the adjoining counties. But this certainly, Sugarloaf, is inside the Francisco Ruiz abstract. Francisco Ruiz is a very, very interesting person. I think Dr. Tums will talk a little more about that. But he was one of only 2 signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence that were native Texans. He was both an officer in the Mexican, the Spanish Army, the Texas, worked with the Republic of Texas, but he was one of only 2. He and Antonio Navarro were the two signers that were native Texans, and so this was his land. Sugarloaf sits on his land. I live on this part of this abstract. But a very interesting guy, and interesting enough, in 1828, he wrote they call it a book. I think it was called A Report on the Indians of Texas. And he really, really had an interest. He was considered very friendly, very respected by the Native Americans in Texas in that period of time. He had a lot of experience with Texas by growing up here and being from a pretty elite family in San Antonio. He explorers of the Native Americans. We have a story of the early settlers. We have a story later on of a gold rush on Sugarloaf, believe it or not, 1996. And then we have a story of what can happen when you have an artifact hunter that kind of goes wild and tears up a mountain. That happened also. So there's a lot of stories here. We're still writing a story about Sugarloaf. Hopefully we're going to write a really good story in the future, that this will be a park out here and you can get into the river and you can go walk up on Sugarloaf. But just going back to, if you went to Oklahoma, you talked to the Tonkawas, and you talked about Sugarloaf Mountain in Milam County. Many of them would say, "Oh yeah, that's our story of creation. That's our Garden of Eden," and they would tell you that their story or their legend was that there was their spirit animal, the wolf, turned over a turtle shell, and out of the turtle shell came the Tonkawa peoples. And the Tonkawa peoples were taught by the wolf, okay, to hunt and to gather and to live peaceably and how to live, and they were taught by the wolf. And so this is kind of their Garden of Eden. They'll all tell you that right here in Milam County. And so that's another good story about Sugarloaf Mountain.